Africa. And they began this mission with the simple philosophy of reaching the whole person for Christ, the body, the mind, the soul. So Dennis Pruitt went on and became a doctor, a brilliant missionary doctor and surgeon. And John Pemberton and his wife moved to southern Rhodesia and began the mission. They built a school to teach the children to read and write. When the Pruitts came later, after Dennis Pruitt finished his schooling, he opened a medical clinic. And then, of course, they established the church there in the school building. So the church was for the soul, the school was for the mind, and the health clinic was for the body. And that has been the simple philosophy of this mission for 64 years now. And today, Hippo Valley Christian Mission, we have 28 mission schools. We have more than 19,000 children currently attending our mission schools. We have an orphan ministry with, I think, 52, 53 kids in it right now. We've had more than 100 kids that we've raised through our orphan ministry over the years. That little health clinic that Dr. Pruitt opened is a full hospital. We have 3 additional health clinics. The mission has established dozens and dozens of churches, built a Bible college, Zimbabwe Christian College, where hundreds of preachers have been trained. It's a fantastic mission. We started a program 5 years ago called Living Proof. And how many of you are Living Proof sponsors? Raise your hand. Look at that. That's awesome. Thank you. So we are now over 1,700 children enrolled in the Living Proof program. And this last September, my wife and I went over to celebrate our 40th wedding anniversary. We went to Zimbabwe. And we hosted the first ever Living Proof College Days at Zimbabwe Christian College, where we brought high school kids from within our Living Proof program, as well as from within our churches, to the Bible college to expose them to the college. And we were expecting 300, we had 800. And it was pandemonium, but it was amazing. It really was. More than 100 kids made decisions for Christ during that 2-day event, and 40 of them made commitments to go into the ministry. So it's a fantastic mission. If you're not familiar, I didn't bring my materials, but you can go online, Hippo Valley Christian Mission. If you want to sponsor one of our children in the Living Proof program, it's $20 a month. That's all it is. And you can do that online. And if you do that, we'll send you a shirt so you can have one of our cool Living Proof shirts. But, normally when I come here, I preach about missions. But this year, your preacher, Shane, is going to be coming to Zimbabwe. I don't know if you knew that or not, but in 2-3 weeks, he's going to be traveling over to Zimbabwe to help us with our annual preaching conference. And so I gave him assignments. I said, here's your assignments. You're going to do this, 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 and this. When you're over there, teach on this. And so he gave me an assignment. He said, we've been reading through the Bible, and this week everybody's reading through the last few chapters of John. If you want to, you could preach a sermon on John chapter 20. And I said, I'll do that, because normally I preach on missions, and I love preaching on missions. I could talk about missions all day, but I'm a preacher at heart, so I like to be able to do something else. So today, I'm going to preach from John chapter 20. So those of you who've been reading through the Bible in the year, if you read through John chapter 20, you read about Jesus' resurrection and the appearances to the women and to the disciples. But you also read in John chapter 20 this interesting interaction that he had with Thomas. Thomas was one of Jesus' 12 disciples. And Thomas has a nickname that the world has given him for 2,000 years. Does anybody know what the nickname of Thomas is? What? Doubting Thomas. Doubting. Isn't it funny how one mistake can stick with a guy his whole life, and even beyond his life, right? And we still use that term, don't we? Oh, you're a doubting Thomas. You're a doubting Thomas. One mistake can stick with a guy his whole life. In 1929, a guy named Roy Regal was a running back for the University of Southern Cal Berkeley, and they were playing in the Rose Bowl against Georgia Tech. And Georgia Tech won the game 8-7, the Rose Bowl. And the reason they won the game 8-7 is because Roy Regal, who was a running back for University of California, Berkeley, picked up a fumble and ran it the other direction and scored for the other team. And even one of his teammates, saw what he was doing and tried to tackle him. And he stiff-armed him and made it into the end zone, for a 2-point safety. And University of California lost by 1 point. So from then on, Roy Regal became known as Wrong Way Roy Regal. And he carried that name the rest of his life. And you can look it up if you don't do it now, but you can Google Wrong Way Roy Regal and the whole story would come up. Isn't that something how one mistake can stick with a guy his whole life? When you think of Bill Buckner, those of you who are baseball fans, you don't think of this great, really a terrific major league player, had over 2,700 hits. That's Hall of Fame numbers, really. Lifetime batting average, I think 289, 290, something like that. But that's not what you think of when you think of Bill Buckner, right? You think of that ground ball that went through his legs in Game 6 of the World Series that cost the Boston Red Sox a World Series. And he died. Bill Buckner died last May. And when they're telling the story, they had to bring up, the ground ball that went between his legs in 1986. One mistake can stick with the guy his whole life. And that's the case with Thomas, I think. Thomas, it says his name was Thomas, called Didymus. And Didymus means twin. So if you're a twin, you've got something in common with Tom. I have cousins, identical twins. And no one could tell them apart, so everyone just called them twin. Hey, twin, come here. Because, but Thomas was a twin. But that's not what he's known for. He's not known for being a twin. Most of you didn't even know he was a twin, did you? But he's a doubter, right? Thomas called Didymus. He dared to express what he was thinking in his heart. I don't believe this. I'm not sure I believe that Jesus rose from the dead. Thomas wasn't there that first Sunday, that first day that Jesus rose from the dead. We don't know why he wasn't there. But he wasn't there when the women came into the room. The Bible says the disciples were behind locked doors for fear of the Jews after Jesus died on Friday. And on Sunday morning, the women went to the tomb and they found it empty. And the angel said, "Why you look for the living among the dead?" And so they ran back and they told the disciples, the apostles. And none of them believed it. That's the irony here. None of them believed it at first. They thought the women were crazy. But Thomas wasn't there that first Sunday when Peter and John ran to the tomb. And it says Peter and John ran to the tomb. And Peter was older, so he was slower. And John was young and fast. And John got there first. And Peter got there after him. But John was scared to go in the tomb. So Peter just went into the tomb. And they found the clothes laying there. And he wasn't there. And anyway, Thomas wasn't there. I don't know why he wasn't there, but he wasn't there. And then later when they told him, because Jesus appeared to them all later. He appeared in the upper room, and he appeared to those men on the road to Emmaus, those disciples who were walking down the road. Jesus appeared and reappeared to several people on that first resurrection morning. But Thomas didn't see it. And if he didn't see it, he wasn't going to believe it. He refused to believe it. In Luke 24, verse 11, it says, the disciples did not believe the women's story, because it seemed to them as nonsense. So Thomas wasn't the only one, but he's the one we've stuck with that label, Doubting Thomas. So let's look at this story. I hope you read it this week, and this will maybe reinforce it. But in John chapter 20, we'll begin with verse 24. So this is in John 20, verse 24. This is 1 week later. 1 week later, which by the Jewish calendar would be 8 days later, because they count the day that you're in. So Sunday to Sunday was 8 days. So this is exactly 1 week later after Jesus rose from the dead. And the disciples are in the upper room again. And they hadn't seen Jesus for a while. And Thomas still hadn't seen him, okay? So they're all in this upper room with the doors locked. And in my mind, they're trying to convince Thomas, come on, Thomas. How can you doubt us? It's us, Thomas. You know us. You have lived with us, walked with us. We have traveled for 3 years, and we saw him. I'm telling you, we saw him. And Thomas is just sitting there, no, I don't believe it. I don't believe it. Any of you like that? Are there any doubting Thomases in this room? You know, some people are just by nature that way, right? You know what I'm talking about? There are some people, they're just wired that way. If the sign says wet paint, how do I know that sign hasn't been there for 3 months, right? I better check and see, right? Any wet paint checkers in this room? So that's what's going on. They're in the upper room. And I think they're all ganging up on Thomas to get him to believe this. All right, verse 24 of John chapter 20. Now Thomas, called Didymus, twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. The other disciples therefore said to him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see in his hands the prints of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." And after 8 days, his disciples were again inside. They're in the upper room. And Thomas was with them. And Jesus came. The doors were shut, but Jesus still came into the room. And he stood in the midst, and he said, "Peace to you." And then he said to Thomas, "Reach your finger here and look at my hands. Reach your hand here and put it in my side. Do not be unbelieving, but believing." And Thomas answered, and he said to him, "My Lord and my God." And then Jesus said, "Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. But blessed are those who have not seen me and yet have believed." And truly Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. So, why didn't Thomas believe? I think there's two questions. Why didn't Thomas believe the disciples? I mean, these weren't strangers to him. These were his comrades. These were his buddies. He'd been, working with them for years, for 3 years. Why didn't he believe them? And the other question I think needs to be asked is, why wasn't he there the first Sunday? Why wasn't he in the room with the other disciples? Where was he? Had he left? Had he abandoned them? Now, there's a lot, and we don't know. And we don't know the answers to these questions. We only can speculate. There's really not a lot about Thomas in the Bible. There's really only, I think, 2 other references to Thomas in the Bible, and it's just a little snippet. One is in John chapter 11, verse 16. Word comes to Jesus that his friend Lazarus was sick, and that Mary and Martha sent a messenger to Jesus saying, "Come, Lazarus is sick, he's dying." And Jesus, after 2 days, said, "Well, we're going to go to Judea and see Lazarus." And the disciples said, "Lord, last time you were in Judea, they tried to kill you. Maybe that's not such a good idea." And Jesus said, No, we're going to go to Judea to see Lazarus. This thing has happened for God's purpose. And the disciples are trying to talk him out of it. And then Thomas speaks up. It's one of the rare glimpses we have of Thomas in the Bible. In John chapter 11, verse 16, Thomas speaks up and says, "Let's go with him and let's die with him." So you might infer from that Thomas is, it's just his nature. Negative. Let's just go and die. Kind of in his nature, I don't believe that. I don't believe that. I don't believe that paint's wet. Maybe he had a bit of a negative Nelly or something. I don't know. Another glimpse we have of Thomas is in Luke chapter 14, where Jesus is talking about the place where my Father has prepared. And the disciples are like, what is it? And Thomas is the one that speaks up and says, how do we know this place? You talk about this place. We don't know this place unless you show us this place. Can you show us it? So he's asking questions. He wants answers. He doesn't want you talking in, generalities. What do you mean this place that you talk about, this place that the Father has prepared? So you kind of put all this together, and you get the idea that Thomas is probably a man who is not unlike some of you, just skeptical by nature. And there's nothing wrong with that. Jesus chose Thomas to be one of his disciples, knowing, he knows everything about us, right? He knows the hairs on our head. And he knew Thomas was just one of these guys that's got to check to see if the paint really is wet or dry. So maybe that's why he didn't believe him. It's just not in his nature to believe something that just seems unbelievable. Now there's other speculations as to why. Some say that he wasn't there because he was disgusted by the hypocrisy of Peter, who denied, I don't even know him, when they arrested Jesus, and the way they all fled. Or maybe he was disgusted with himself because it says they all fled, Maybe he was disgusted. Maybe that's why he wasn't in the upper room on that first Lord's Day. There's people who, are still kind of that way. I'm not going to that church full of hypocrites, or I don't deserve to go to church because of things I've done. Maybe that's what was going on with Thomas. Maybe he was embarrassed. It wasn't popular to be a follower of Jesus in those last days. Not one bit. And maybe it's hard to have faith when the world disapproves. Or maybe it was just he wasn't going to take their word for it. It could have been they were just delusional. Sometimes people want to believe something so bad that they imagine things. And so maybe that was what he was thinking. I heard what you said. I heard about the men on the road. I heard about the grave clothes, but I just can't believe it. When someone dies, they die. Dead is dead, and unless, look at that verse 25. It's really powerful. He said, unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger there and put my hand into his side, I will not believe it. And that word used twice there, put. It's a strong word in the original language. It means thrust. So he's talking very, emphatically. Unless I put my finger in there and put my hand in the side, I'm not going to believe it. Well, now it's a week later. They're all in that room. And, you can just imagine the conversation. Come on, Thomas. Well, where is he? I don't see him. Thomas, we saw him. He was here. He came into the room. We were sitting here just like we are a week ago. And he came into the room. He said, peace be still. And we touched him. And the women, they saw him. And Mary grabbed him. And he said, Mary, stop grabbing me. And the men on the road to Emmaus, and we ran to his tomb. And the grave clothes were laying there. Thomas, I'm telling you, he's alive. Yep, not going to believe it. Not going. So they're having this conversation. This has got to be, they're remembering, man, it was just 1 week ago today. Can you believe that? Yeah, he was right there. He was standing right there. And as they're having this conversation, Jesus pops into the room again. And he doesn't use the door because he's resurrected. He's the resurrected. He's not a ghost. He's not a ghost. It wasn't Jesus' ghost that was floating around. Jesus was resurrected bodily. He wasn't resuscitated. There's a difference. There's a difference between resurrection and resuscitation. There were people in the Bible who miraculously were dead and came back to life. But they died again. Okay, they were just resuscitated. Jesus, the Bible says, was resurrected. He was the first fruits of those who will come. So God took his dead, lifeless body and resurrected it into a new and glorified body. He was the first one. The same kind of body that we'll have. Those of us who've put our faith in Christ will be resurrected one day. Not resuscitated, resurrected. And resurrected is a whole lot better than resuscitated. Because if you're resuscitated, you're still stuck with the bad knees and all those things, right? And you're still getting older, and you're going to get sick and die. If you're resurrected, you don't get sick anymore, and you don't have bad knees, and it's wonderful. So Jesus, and apparently you can walk through walls, which is cool, right? So Jesus just pops into the room, right in the middle of this discussion. Maybe even it was a heated discussion, I don't know. But he pops into the room and says, "Peace be still," and there he is again. And the upper room, it wasn't a big thing. It was, maybe like the size of this area right here. So they're all up in there, 12 of them, maybe more. And then Jesus just appears into the room. And immediately, his eyes go to Thomas. Thomas is sitting over there in the corner. I don't believe it. And immediately, Jesus is in the room, and his eyes catch Thomas. And he walks straight to him. Everybody steps aside, right? He walks straight to Thomas. And he says, "Thomas, you want to touch it? Here it is. Put your finger there. Here, put your hand here." And I hope when we get to heaven, we get to see scenes of things that happened, because I just want to see that. I want to see Thomas's. But you know what he did? It doesn't say this. It doesn't say that he fell to his knees. It doesn't tell us that. But it does tell us what Thomas said. He said, "My Lord and my God." I mean, he wasn't a doubter anymore. He believed it. And he would be Jesus' man forever. In verse 29, Jesus said to Thomas and the rest in the room, "Because you have seen me, now you believe. But blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe." See, that's you. And these things, John adds, these things, all these stories, were written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. See, this story of Thomas is kind of, the grand crescendo of this whole book of John. John begins with, in the beginning was the Word was God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh, and he became one of us. He came into his own, but his own didn't receive him. And then it ends with Thomas confessing, "My Lord, my God." This little story of doubting Thomas is kind of a microcosm of the whole Gospel of John, as this doubter moved from doubt to faith. These things were written that you might also become a believer, that you might move from doubt to faith. So let me kind of sum all this up by talking. I want to talk to those who may be in this room, who might be identifying a little bit with Thomas. You believe some, you're just not sure. You're a paint checker, right? I want to suggest a couple of things for you to move from being a doubter to a person of faith. Jesus doesn't scold Thomas here. I mean, I think he messes with him a little bit. Hey, big boy, you want to touch it? Touch it, But Jesus loved Thomas. He chose Thomas. He knew that these guys that maybe they're skeptics, when they do become believers, they are sold out. So Jesus doesn't dislike honest doubters. See, there's a difference between an honest doubter and someone who's, a dishonest doubter, someone who just doesn't want to believe. Thomas was an honest doubter. So, if you want to move from doubt to faith, here's a couple of things. Number one, be with people of faith. Associate with people of faith. The first week, Thomas wasn't there. Who knows why, but he wasn't there. But the second week, he was there. He was with them. He was shaking his head saying, I don't believe it, but at least he was there. He put himself in a position where he could have faith. When I used to preach not too far from here in Columbus, Georgia, and there was a lady there, a lady that we'd baptized. A friend had brought her to church, and she came to Christ, and we baptized her. And I don't know if it was a month or two later, she just quit coming. And I asked her friend, I said, where's she been? And her friend said, well, she goes, she's just going through a hard time right now, and she just needs to stay away. I thought, what kind of logic is that? You know? Okay, if she's going through a hard time, the last thing you should do is stay away from the house of God and the people of God. You hear what I'm saying? But we're like that, aren't we? Somebody said humans are the strangest of all God's creatures. We run the fastest when we don't know where we're going. We run the fastest when we're running in the wrong direction. And if there's ever a time to not stay away, it's when you're going through a season of doubt, or you're going through a personal struggle, whether it's a moral struggle or any kind of struggle. All the more reason to be around the people of faith. So Thomas, you got to hand it to him. He wasn't there the first week. He wasn't convinced, but he put himself in a position where he could become a believer. Sure, there's hypocrites. Sure, there's flawed people. But he put himself in a place where he could have faith. Jesus said, if you seek me, you'll find me. If you seek me with all your heart. See, that's the difference between an honest doubter and a dishonest doubter. And Thomas was an honest doubter. So number one, you say, well, I'm just not there yet. I'm not convinced. Keep coming. Keep coming. Keep being around people of faith. Number two, examine the evidence. Honestly, look at the evidence. Thomas was a skeptic by nature, but once he saw the evidence, once he saw the hand, once he saw the wound in the side, he became a believer. The problem is, just being frank, the problem isn't the evidence. The evidence is pretty convincing. The problem is, many don't want the truth. G.K. Chesterton famously said, Christianity has not been tried and found wanting, but Christianity is difficult and it's not been tried. You hear me? It's not that Christianity has been tried and found wanting. It's difficult. So we don't want to try it. Jesus said, if you're going to follow after me, you got to take up your cross and follow. It's not, pie in the sky, by and by. It's difficult. So it hasn't been tried. The fact is, the truth is, reality is, many of the people that we counter day by day who say, I'm not a believer, are not a believer by choice. They choose to doubt. I read something that just shocked me, and it's been a few years ago, but I've double read it, and I think it's probably true, but it still shocks me. And the number, something like 70 to 75% of people in America, who would say, I am not a Christian, but 75% of those people still believe that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. Now think about that. Think about that. 7 out of 10 people who say, I am not a Christian, but they still believe in the historical resurrection of Jesus from the dead. And that baffles me. How can you, on one hand, believe that Jesus did in fact resurrect from the dead and not let that transform your life? Well, I'll tell you why. Because faith isn't always convenient. Billy Graham used to say there's 2 reasons that people doubt. One is pleasure, the other is pride. I'm too proud, And the other is I don't want to give up. I don't want to change my lifestyle. Following God will make me unhappy, and I want to be happy. It's not the evidence. It's more often than not the cost. Thomas said, "My Lord, my God." He didn't just accept the reality. Okay, all right, I believe it. He rose from the dead, big whoop. It transformed his life. My Lord, my God. And maybe you're an honest seeker, and you're wondering. And God's advice to you is examine the evidence. Here. And the evidence, we don't have time to go into it, but it's overwhelming. It's overwhelming. The tomb is empty. The grave clothes were left behind. There are something like 15 historical references of people who saw, touched, ate, interacted with Jesus. Our calendar is based on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. See, everybody's all worked up about this 2020, whatever today is, I think it's just Groundhog's Day, but still, it's the year 2020 AD, right? Year of our Lord. The year of our Lord 2020. Our calendar is based on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. All of Jerusalem knew about it. It wasn't done in secret. The evidence is absolutely overwhelming. Stop doubting and believe. Well, let me say a final thing. If you want to move from doubt to faith, you have to act on the faith you have. You have to act on what you say, well, I don't have it all figured out. Act on the faith you have. John's gospel is a fascinating look at this whole moving from the Word became flesh to Thomas saying, my Lord and my God. And the whole purpose of the book is that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And once Thomas saw him, he confessed it. He may not have had all the answers, but he acted on the faith that he had. In 1847, they built the first ever drawbridge across Niagara Falls. This is 1847. They didn't have the equipment and technologies that we have today. But the job was given to a certain engineer, and this is how it began. This is how the very first drawbridge across Niagara Falls was built. They announced a contest to any boy that can fly a kite from one side of the falls to the other would receive $5. So hundreds and hundreds of boys came from all over to try to fly a kite over Niagara Falls. Well, one kid could see the way the winds were swirling and all that, and he took a canoe to the other side and did it from the Canadian side. On his second attempt, he got his kite to land on the other side and got $5 for it. But they took that kite string and they secured it, and they took a bigger string and pulled it across to the other side. And then they took a little rope, and they pulled it to the other side, and then a bigger rope, and then cable. That's how they built the first drawbridge over Niagara Falls. It started with a kite string. Jesus said, if you have faith of a mustard seed, that's enough. That'll get you there. So you may not have it all worked out, but act on the faith that you have. Move from doubt to faith. So what happened to Thomas? We don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us, but history, tradition, all that tells us that he went to India as an apostle, as a missionary. And they had to kill him to shut him up. They had to kill him to get him to stop proclaiming that Jesus Christ had risen from the dead. You see, that's been my experience with doubters, honest doubters. Once they're convinced, man, there is no turning them back. There's I don't know if you've seen the movie adaptation of the Alexander Dumas book, Count of Monte Cristo. Anyway, the latest one, I love that movie, is this great scene where Edmund, he escapes from the prison after all these years. And he escapes and he lands on this island. He's so excited that he's finally free from that dungeon, but he soon realizes he's not alone. There's all these pirates, right? And they're going to kill him. But they're going to, they're sporting men, so they're going to give him a chance to defend himself. So they take their very best knife fighter, Jacobo or whatever his name was, and they said, we're going to let you fight Jacobo to the death. If you kill him, you can join us and be a pirate with us, so you get to live. If he kills you, well, you know. And by the way, he's our best fighter. So Edmund says, well, all right, sounds like a deal. So the two men start to fight, and Edmund's, of course, he's the Count of Monte Cristo. He's amazing, and he immediately, very quickly pins him down, and, and everyone's like, kill him, kill him, kill him. And he just puts the sword in the stand. He said, oh, come on, what's the point in killing him? He's your best knife fighter. Well, second best. Why don't you let him live? And the captain of the pirates says, what do you guys say? Should Jacobo live? They go, yeah, let him live. They said, okay, he can live. Come on, join us. So the two men get up. And Jacobo, he just had been embarrassed, but his life was spared, right? Anybody else would have just killed him. And he gets up. And he grabs, Edmund, the Count of Monte Cristo, by the shoulders, and he gets right in his face, and he says, I swear to you, I swear on my dead relatives, and even on the ones who aren't feeling too good, I am your man forever. And that's what Thomas did. When he saw the hands, he said, Jesus, I am your man forever. So what about you? Are you a doubter who's just been living in your doubts and waiting to have 100%, validation? We're going to, Heather, let's come up. And Shane told me I could give an invitation, so I'm going to give an invitation this morning. And, it's God's invitation. It's not mine. But it's God's invitation to you. And maybe there's someone here today who has been an honest doubter. There's a place, there's a time when you've got to act on what faith you have. You may not have every, T crossed, but act on the faith that you have. Thomas confessed. He said, my Lord and my God. There's a place in the Bible. In fact, it's part of the plan of salvation, I believe. This thing we call the good confession. In Matthew 16, Jesus said to Peter, Peter, who do you say I am? And he said, well, some people say you're this. And he said, no, who do you say I am? Matthew 16, Jesus said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus said, bingo. You didn't come up with that. God gave you that. In Acts chapter 8, Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch. Can I be baptized? He said, if you believe. He said, I believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Going back to the very beginning of the church, this idea of confessing Christ. There's something powerful in that. There's something powerful in saying in front of people, in front of witnesses, I believe that Jesus is the Christ. I believe it. It's not my parents' faith. It's my belief. I believe that Jesus, not Muhammad, Jesus is the Christ. He's the Messiah. He's the anointed one. He's the one. He's the way. He's the truth. He's the light. No one comes to the Father except through him. I believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. So if you're ready to make that confession and follow the example of our young new sister and be baptized into Christ and be his man or his woman forever, that's the invitation this morning. So let's all stand. And if you are ready to make a decision for Christ, why not today? Come forward.